Chapter 1 of The Shuttle by Frances Hodgson Burnett. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tabithat. The Shuttle by Frances Hodgson Burnett. Chapter 1. The Weaving of the Shuttle. No man knew when the shuttle began its slow and heavy weaving from shore to shore that it was held and guided by the great hand of fate. Fate alone saw the meaning of the web it wove, the might of it and its place in the making of a world's history. Men thought but little of either web or weaving, calling them by other names and lighter ones, for the time unconscious of the strength of the thread thrown across thousands of miles of leaping, heaving grey or blue ocean. Fate and life planned the weaving, and it seemed mere circumstance which guided the shuttle to and fro between two worlds, divided by a gulf broader and deeper than the thousands of miles of salt, fierce sea, the gulf of a bitter quarrel, deepened by hatred and the shedding of brothers' blood. Between the two worlds of east and west there was no will to draw nearer, each held apart. Those who had rebelled against that which their souls called tyranny, having struggled madly and shed blood in tearing themselves free, turned stern backs upon their unconquered enemies, broke all cords that bound them to the past, flinging off ties of name, kinship and rank, beginning with fierce disdain a new life. Those who, being rebelled against, found the rebels too passionate in their determination and too desperate in their defence of their strongholds to be less than unconquerable, sailed back haughtily to the world which seemed so far the greater power. Plunging into new battles, they added new conquests and splendour to their land, looking back with something of contempt to the half-savage West, left to build its own civilization without other aid than the strength of its own strong right hand and strong uncultured brain. But while the two worlds held apart, the shuttle, weaving slowly in the great hand of fate, drew them closer and held them firm, each of them all unknowing for many a year that what had first been mere threads of gossamer was forming a web whose strength in time none could compute, whose severance could be accomplished but by tragedy and convulsion. The weaving was but in its early and slow-moving years when this story opens. Steamers crossed and recrossed the Atlantic, but they accomplished the journey at leisure and with heavy rollings, and all such discomforts as small craft can afford. Their staterooms and decks were not crowded with people to whom the voyage was a mere incident, in many cases a yearly one. A crossing in those days was an event. It was planned seriously, long thought of, discussed and rediscussed, with and among the various members of the family to whom the voyager belonged. A certain boldness, bordering on recklessness, was almost to be presupposed in the individual who, turning his back upon New York, Philadelphia, Boston, and like cities, turned his face towards Europe. In those days, when the shuttle wove at leisure, a man did not lightly run over to London or Paris or Berlin. He gravely went to Europe. The journey being likely to be made once in a lifetime, the traveller's intention was to see as much as possible, to visit as many cities, cathedrals, ruins, galleries as his time and purse would allow. People who could speak with any degree of familiarity of Hyde Park, the Champs-Élysées, the Pincio, had gained a certain dignity. The ability to touch with an intimate bearing upon such localities was a raison de plus for being asked out to tea or to dinner. To possess photographs and relics was to be of interest. To have seen European celebrities, even at a distance, to have wandered about the outside of poets' gardens and philosophers' houses, was to be entitled to respect. The period was a far cry from the time when the shuttle, having shot to and fro, faster and faster, week by week, month by month, weaving new threads into its web each year, has woven warp and woof until they bind far shore to shore. It was in comparatively early days that the first thread we follow was woven into the web. Many such have been woven since, and have added greater strength than any others, twining the cord of sex and home-building and race-founding. But this was a slight and weak one, being only the thread of the life of one of Reuben Vanderpoel's daughters, the pretty little simple one whose name was Rosalie. They were, the Vanderpoels, of the Americans whose fortunes were a portion of the history of their country. The building of these fortunes had been a part of or had created epochs and crises. Their millions could scarcely be regarded as private property. Newspapers bandied them about, so to speak, employing them as factors in argument, using them as figures of speech, incorporating them into methods of calculation. Literature touched upon them, moral systems considered them, Stories for the Young treated them gravely as illustrative. The first Reuben Vanderpoel, who in early days of danger had traded with savages for the pelts of wild animals, was the lauded hero of stories of thrift and enterprise. Throughout his hard-working life, he had been irresistibly impelled to action by an absolute genius of commerce, expressing itself at the outset by the exhibition of courage in mere exchange and barter. An alert power to perceive the potential value of things and the possible malleability of men and circumstances had stood him in marvellous good stead. He had bought at low prices things which in the eyes of the less discerning were worthless, but having obtained possession of such things, the less discerning had almost invariably awakened to the fact that in his hands values increased, and methods of remunerative disposition being sought were found. Nothing remained unutilizable. The practical, sordid, uneducated little man developed the power to create demand for his own supplies. If he was betrayed into an error, he quickly retrieved it. He could live upon nothing, and consequently could travel anywhere in search of such things as he desired. He could barely read and write, and could not spell, but he was daring and astute. His untaught brain was that of a financier. His blood burned with the fever of but one desire, the desire to accumulate. Money expressed to his nature not expenditure but investment in such small or large properties as could be resold for profit in the near or far future. The future held fascinations for him. He bought nothing for his own pleasure or comfort, nothing which could not be sold or bartered again. He married a woman who was a trader's daughter and shared his passion for gain. She was of north of England blood, her father having been a hard-fisted small tradesman in an unimportant town, who had been daring enough to emigrate when emigration meant the facing of unknown dangers in a half-savage land. She had excited Reuben Vanderpoel's admiration by taking off her petticoat one bitter winter's day to sell it to a squaw, in exchange for an ornament for which she chanced to know another squaw would pay with a skin of value. The first Mrs. Vanderpoel was as wonderful as her husband. They were both wonderful. They were the founders of the fortune which, a century and a half later, was the delight, in fact the pièce de résistance, of New York society reporters, its enormity being restated in round figures when a blank space must be filled up. The method of statement lent itself to infinite variety, and was always interesting to a particular class, some elements of which felt it encouraging to be assured that so much money could be a personal possession, some elements feeling the fact an additional argument to be used against the infamy of monopoly. The first Reuben Vanderpoel transmitted to his son his accumulations and his fever for gain. He had but one child. The second Reuben built upon the foundations this afforded him a fortune as much larger than the first as the rapid growth and increasing capabilities of the country gave him enlarging opportunities to acquire. It was no longer necessary to deal with savages. His powers were called upon to cope with those of white men who came to a new country to struggle for livelihood and fortune. Some were shrewd, some were desperate, some were dishonest. But shrewdness never outwitted, desperation never overcame, dishonesty never deceived the second Reuben Vanderpoel. Each characteristic ended by adapting itself to his own purposes and qualities, and as a result of each it was he who in any business transaction was the gainer. It was the common saying that the Vanderpoels were possessed of a money-making spell. Their spell lay in their entire mental and physical absorption in one idea. Their peculiarity was not so much that they wished to be rich, as that nature itself impelled them to collect wealth as the lodestone draws towards it iron. Having possessed nothing, they became rich. Having become rich, they became richer. Having founded their fortunes on small schemes, they increased them by enormous ones. In time they attained that omnipotence of wealth which it would seem no circumstance can control or limit. The first Reuben Vanderpoel could not spell, the second could. The third was as well educated as a man could be whose sole profession is money-making. His children were taught all that expensive teachers and expensive opportunities could teach them. After the second generation, the meagre and mercantile physical type of the Vanderpoels improved upon itself. Feminine good looks appeared, and were made the most of. The Vanderpoel element invested even good looks to an advantage. The fourth Reuben Vanderpoel had no son and 2 daughters. They were brought up in a brownstone mansion built upon a fashionable New York thoroughfare roaring with traffic. To the furthest point of the Rocky Mountains the number of dollars this mansion, it was always called so, had cost was known. There may have existed Pueblo Indians who had heard rumours of the price of it. All the shopkeepers and farmers in the United States had read newspaper descriptions of its furnishings, and knew the value of the brocade which hung in the bedrooms and boudoirs of the Misses Vanderpoel. It was a fact much cherished that Miss Rosalie's bath was of Carrara marble, and to good souls actively engaged in doing their own washing in small New England or Western towns, it was a